It is my privilege to present to you 20 video lectures on my favorite theologian, Jonathan Edwards, who has meant more to me, theologically speaking, than anyone living or dead has actually meant. And while he may not figure quite that largely in your lives, I'm sure that any of you who become acquainted with the sermons and other writings of this famous Puritan of the 18th century are going to be deeply affected, if not actually converted, by the ministry of his word. Now, we begin today with this first in a series of 20 on his theology. But we must, of course, say a word about his general stance and his biography. As I say, this series is in a sense a condensation and popularization and introduction of the conclusion of my little trilogy on what I call the rational biblical theology of Jonathan Edwards. His theology was profoundly rational, but it was even more profoundly biblical. But as we will see throughout this whole series, for Edwards, the rational and the biblical were perfectly harmonious. If there was ever any conflict between them, it was because of the interpreter and not because of the subject. So though there have been other biographies of Edwards written, and far more biographical than this, and other theologies, this particular one focuses on that central aspect of his Christian message, being basically rational and fundamentally biblical revelatory. So any of you who are at all dubious about Christianity or feel that it rests entirely on an absolute trust in the Bible may be interested to know that the greatest philosopher theologian that America has ever seen thought otherwise, and that the evidence for God's existence that prepares us for the evidence of his special revelation in the Bible are perfectly harmonious. And those of you, on the other hand, who know the inspiration of the Bible and have been living on its verities will find in Edwards a great aid to your understanding of the sacred book. The tapes will be essentially an oral condensation of these volumes that I have mentioned, and something of a popularization of them as well. As the publication begins with a sketch of Edwards's life, this tape will lead off with a sketch of the sketch. In many ways, the life of Edwards parallels that of his Lord. Until about 30 years of age, he was little known beyond his own family and immediate friends. However, that period may have seen the unfolding of the greatest genius in the history of the human race. I repeat, the greatest genius in the history of the human race. It depends on whether he wrote what he wrote at the age he is traditionally supposed to have written what he wrote. Today's researches have raised deep questions about if they have not destroyed the historic tradition about Edwards's early writings. What is certain is that in those hidden years, collegiate years especially, Edwards learned by his sufferings that God, quote, calls me to expect no other than to meet with difficulties and trials while in this world. This son of a congregational manse in East Windsor, Connecticut, was born October 5th, 1703. A balanced life and curriculum was Edwards's at home before he left for Yale at 12. Growing up in the learned atmosphere of the academic, Harvard-trained graduate pastor, Father Timothy, the son was studying Latin at 6. His native genius was thoroughly exercised virtually from birth. Surrounded by a loving mother and 10 affectionate sisters, refinement of sensitivity was not neglected. His spiritual stirrings were evident too. In his own opinion, however, they were not true religious affections, which were not to come until his much later conversion at about 20 years of age. Among the great theologians of the church, Jonathan Edwards is somewhat unique in having no past. As a young man, he was writing a famous ethereal ode about a 13-year-old girl he was not to marry for several years. No Augustine. Thomas Aquinas had to escape worldly parents to pursue his career, not Edwards, for whom it was a natural. Luther was a superstitious coal miner's son whose call to ministry had to be a bolt of lightning. John Calvin spent his life combating the theology in which he had been reared. Edwards's life was of a peace from birth to rebirth to death. Yet no one was to write more profoundly of the absolute difference between nature and grace. One might have anticipated Christian nurture a century before it was written by Horace Bushnell instead of sinners in the hands of an angry God. In September of 1716, Edwards matriculated at a nascent Yale, which was younger than he was. An unsavory split occurred while Edwards was among the few students. More than half of his collegiate education had to be in Wethersfield, Connecticut. His education there and at New Haven included thorough grounding in Reformed theology, along with avant-garde Lockean empiricism and Newtonian physics. Locke was a great British philosopher who even in those early years was influencing this budding genius. And of course, everyone knows of Isaac Newton, whose studies in the universe had crossed the Atlantic and reached the fascinated attention of Jonathan Edwards. According to Samuel Hopkins, Edwards's profound and impressive major philosophical outlook was already evident at 13 years of age. By 20, Edwards had noticed more than the profundity of Locke and the intricacies of his own writings on the mind. This is what he wrote about a certain young lady then 13 years of age. They say there is a young lady in New Haven who is beloved of that great being who made and rules the world, and that there are certain seasons in which this great being, in some way or other invisible, comes to her and fills her mind with exceeding sweet delight, and that she hardly cares for anything except to meditate on him, that she expects after a while to be redeemed up where he is, to be raised up out of this world and caught up into heaven, being assured that he loves her too well to let her remain at a distance from him always. There she is to dwell with him and to be ravished with his love and delight forever. Therefore, if you present all the world before her with the richest of its treasures, she disregards it and cares not for it, and is unmindful of any pain or affliction. She has a strange sweetness in her mind and a singular purity in her affections, is most just and conscientious in all her conduct, and you could not persuade her to do anything wrong or sinful if you would give her all the world, lest she should offend this great being. She is of a wonderful sweetness, calmness, and universal benevolence of mind, especially after this great God has manifested himself to her mind. She will sometimes go about from place to place, singing sweetly, and seems to be always full of joy and pleasure, and no one knows for what. She loves to be alone, walking in the fields and groves, and seems to have someone invisible always conversing with her. This was Sarah Pierpont, the daughter of a congregational minister in New Haven, who Edwards was later, when he went to Northampton, to propose and have her join him in marriage. About 4 years later, Jonathan Edwards married this young lady, and he and their 8 daughters and 3 sons shared the trials and joys of 2 congregational manses. During these obscure years, Edwards's resolutions, as he called them, were written only from December 18, 1722 to August the 17th, 1723, but were conscientiously carried out in practice the rest of his days. December 1722, he began his diary, mainly to check his progress on his resolutions. It came to an end 2 decades before its author, June the 11th, 1739. His miscellanies, or miscellaneous observations, considered by some the most important, incompletely published and edited works Edwards ever produced, began about the same time, but were ended only by the end of his life in 1758. The early part of the Northampton ministry may be considered Edwards's period of obscurity. As I'm saying, there's a certain general structural similarity to the life of his Lord, the first year of which was a year of obscurity. And then came the year of popularity. And then the last year of rejection in the life of Jesus Christ, as we all know. Edwards has passed now his years of obscurity, and the year of popularity was to begin with his preaching success in Northampton. The early part of the Northampton ministry may be considered Edwards's period of obscurity, for he labored under the shadow of his famous grandfather. Though Solomon Stoddard, died in 1729, the shadow followed Edwards's 23-year ministry there. The prestige of Edwards's office as pastor of Western Massachusetts' most distinguished parish accounts for his invitation to preach in Boston, 1731, resulting in his first publication, the strong Calvinistic sermon, God Glorified in the Work of Redemption by the Greatness of Man's Dependence upon Him in the Whole of It. The publication of his exposition of Matthew 16:17, the famous divine and supernatural light immediately imparted to the soul by the Spirit of God, shown to be both a scriptural and rational doctrine, in 1734, was based on requests by his own congregation. Now, Edwards's year of popularity began with the first awakening under his ministry in 34 and 35. The congregation, listening to his deeply penetrating studies of Scripture, always full of searching application or use, must have sensed that a greater than Solomon Stoddard was there, great as Stoddard was. Whether they did or not, God hit them over the head when he himself seemed to add heavenly power to his servants' fiery messages. Even then, Jonathan Edwards, famous for his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, preached in 1741. Even then, almost a decade before, he was preaching hell-fire sermons, not exclusively, of course, but they were by no means eliminated from his regular preaching ministry. For example, a sermon on Jeremiah 6:29 and 30 was entitled that it argues great danger of being finally left of God when sinners have lived long, unconverted, under eminent means of conversion. Again, on Matthew 5:22, the title of the sermon is, Punishment in Another World Will Be in Proportion to the Sin People Are Guilty of. On Matthew 13:41, he preached, The wicked hereafter will be cast into a furnace of fire. Again, when the saints in glory shall see the wrath of God executed on ungodly men, it will be no occasion of grief to them, but of rejoicing. These were sermons that Edwards was preaching before the awakening broke out, and undoubtedly had something to do with the arousing of the people to their peril. Suddenly, Northampton was ablaze, and the flames were soon all over the adjacent areas. After the revival fires were put out by his own uncle's suicide, Edwards himself was to tell the story of this forerunner of what we all know as the Great Awakening. These are, in a sense, little great awakenings. But everybody who has studied American church history at all has heard about this awakening, especially around 1740, and with the leading figure being the British evangelist George Whitefield, though Edwards and Tennant and other Americans were associated with him. But on this first little awakening, he wrote the history of it, which wasn't published, however, until 37. He noticed the suddenly changed behavior of young and old, moral and loose, as the revival spread up and down the Connecticut River Valley. When the events interested Benjamin Coleman, pastor of the Brattle Street Church in Boston, Edwards obliged him with a correspondence account, which, when shown to excited readers in England, led ultimately to the revised publication. In 1740, following the visit of Whitefield and others, including Edwards himself, the Great Awakening brought much wider, though perhaps less profound, effects in their train as America's keenest psychologist of Christian experience probed the realities beneath the religious epiphenomena. Some thoughts concerning the present revival of religion in New England compares to the faithful narrative as the principle to the practice. At any rate, in 1746 came his immortal Religious Affections as the definitive statement growing out of biblical knowledge and Great Awakening experience of the definition of true religious affections, which marked the conversion of a soul, the absence of which would indicate the opposite. Jonathan Edwards was voted out of his Northampton congregation in July 1750. Why? Fundamentally because he could not find biblical support for baptizing infant children whose parents were not church members, were not communicant church members, nor making such parents communicant members who didn't believe they had a saving experience, even though they believed Orthodox Christianity and were outwardly respectable, moral persons. Even an humble attempt to promote visible union of God's people, an extraordinary prayer for the revival of religion in 1748, a response to British requests for America to join in a world revival, nor the account of the life of the late Reverend Mr. David Brainerd in 1749 could save its author, Edwards. Rising well above Northampton and New England, Edwards's writings were a powerful plea for the first great Protestant world ecumenical effort, going deeply into a study of doctrine and piety of the great father of American foreign missions, David Brainerd, could not save Jonathan Edwards from the fury of the locals, whose carnal access to the Lord's Supper itself had been the heritage of the Pope of Western Massachusetts, Solomon Stoddard, whose ghost rose to slay his nobler grandson. The actual dismissal of Edwards from Northampton came about in this way. Suspicious from the beginning of converting ordinance doctrine of Stoddard, Edwards's children became convinced that the Lord's table was only for the Lord's children, not for the unconverted. That is, only those who, in addition to orthodox belief and outwardly Christian behavior, could give some credible claim to inner grace, as well could be for communicant for themselves and have baptism for their children. With his clear departure from his grandfather Stoddard, and without the protection of his most powerful friend and defender, Colonel John Stoddard, Solomon's son, recently deceased, Jonathan Edwards was set upon by an enraged parish, its feelings aroused by no other than the son of the suicide victim of the earliest awakening, viewing itself and its children as suddenly unchurched and exposed. Its male members voted 10-1, 200-10, that the greatest preacher ever to adorn an American pulpit be ignominiously dismissed. Now, as this great champion of God, Edwards moved through the crucifixion of his last months as if utterly untouched by all the clamor, except as his farewell sermon revealed deep concern that those who now hated him so much now hurt themselves and their and his dear children. I may say this episode of 1750 seems like the great tragedy, the crucifixion, as it were, of Jonathan Edwards. But just as Christ, in his crucifixion, achieved the redemption of the world, so in his own role, Jonathan Edwards, buried, as it were, in a little village 50 miles away, wrote his greatest works, Freedom of the Will, and also the great treatise on original sin and other, on which his fame to this day primarily rests. And then almost as a kind of resurrection at the end of his life, the new Princeton University of New Jersey, recognizing this ignored genius, called him to be president. Edwards didn't want to go. He knew he had an ideal circumstance for the completing of his greatest work, but his friends advised him to go, and though he broke down in tears, he followed their counsel instead of his own wisdom, and God seemed to frown on what Edwards did, because in a few months after arrival there, Edwards died of asphyxiation through a smallpox inoculation. I have time now just to read the epitaph on his tomb in Princeton, New Jersey. Wouldst thou know, O traveler, what manner of man he was, whose mortal part lies here? A man indeed, in body tall, yet graceful, attenuated through assiduity and abstinence and studies most intense, in the acuteness of his intellect, his sagacious judgment, and his prudence, second to none among mortals, in his knowledge of science and the liberal arts remarkable, in sacred criticism eminent, and a theologian distinguished without equal, an unconquered defender of the Christian faith, and a preacher grave, solemn, discriminating, and by the favor of God, most happy in the success and issue of his life, illustrious in his piety, sedate in manners, but toward others friendly and benignant. He lived to be loved and venerated, and now, alas, to be lamented in his death. The bereaved college mourns for him, and the church mourns, but heaven rejoices to receive him. Go hence, O traveler, and his pious footsteps follow.